I'm Professor Richard Toye, and with me is Dr. Henry Knight Lozano, and this is the latest in our Centre for Imperial and Global History podcasts. And we're going to be talking today about Henry's book, California and Hawaii Bound, US Settler Colonialism and the Pacific West, 1848 to 1959. Thank you for joining us, Henry.
Thanks, Richard. Thank you very much.
Now, why bring these two particular places, California and Hawaii, together when talking about this particular period?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just hold it up here so folks can see this is a real thing. They're both sort of western frontiers of US expansion, US territorial growth in the 19th century. California is acquired in the 1840s, Hawaii in the 1890s. But I'm interested in the fact that whereas California is typically kind of assumed to be part of the American West, Hawaii often isn't. It kind of isn't framed either in sort of popular notions of the West, but also in much of the historiography. So one of the aims of the book is to actually focus more on the connections, material and conceptual, that bind California and Hawaii, and to suggest that actually the continental expansion and this trans-Pacific expansion are more closely connected, and particularly through the lens of US settler colonialism than has previously been suggested.
And so how did people kind of frame the two different territories at the time?
Well, the book begins in really with the 1840s and the US ambitions, both kind of presidential and popular ambitions to extend to the Pacific coast, which is one of the driving factors in the United States going to war with Mexico and the acquisition of what is the modern US Southwest. But what you see, and some of these expansionists believe that is the sort of natural end of the line, if you like, and that is the end of sort of manifest destiny. But many others, including many who go out to California, see Hawaii, 2,000 odd miles further off into the Pacific, as a kind of natural or inevitable acquisition to follow. Many of them go out there to Hawaii, and while that doesn't happen, the Kingdom of Hawaii resists these kind of architects of US annexation. There are these visions emerging as early as the 1840s that Hawaii will eventually become part of the United States.
I mean, I suppose is that an interesting difference between California and Hawaii, that Hawaii had its own sort of functional and kind of recognized government.
Yes, and this is an important reason why the Hawaiian Monarchy, the constitutional monarchy at the head of the Kingdom of Hawaii, are able to resist US kind of expansionist ambitions for a long time. And indeed, even in the 1890s, after there is a kind of settler coup to overthrow Queen Liliuokalani, and efforts are made to convince the US Congress to annex Hawaii by these men like Loren Thurston and Sanford Dole. The native supporters of the Hawaiian monarchy remain very committed to a restoration of the Queen and a restoration of Hawaiian independence. And one of the ways they do this is they can point back to numerous international treaties that the Kingdom of Hawaii have signed with other global powers and global nations. In contrast to Native American tribes who did not have anything like those kind of legal or treaty protections with the federal government and state governments in California, and who are, particularly in the gold rush era, are treated extremely brutally by white settlers who come into California.
And so I'm trying to think about the imperial dimension of this. In the 1890s, obviously a time when the United States is expanding and getting a formal empire in the Philippines, part of the Spanish-American War. To what extent of the acquisition of Hawaii and that process sort of linked in people's minds?
Yeah, I think it's very important in a when we look at the timing of the formal acquisition of Hawaii. It happens in the summer of 1898 under the McKinley administration, and one of the kind of expedient causes of that is the fact that the United States is at war with Spain, is at war in the Caribbean, but also across the Pacific in the Philippines. And Hawaii has long been viewed as this important sort of way station, kind of median point in the Pacific. And what's happening in the Philippines, adds a whole new urgency and a kind of, a jingoistic element to all of this. But what I suggest also in the book is it's not only about that by any means. Actually, there is a longer history here in which pro-annexationists, both in Hawaii but also in the US, are seeking to suggest that Hawaii must be maintained as held as a US territory. Otherwise, it will pose a threat to the United States. Eventually, someone else will claim it, and there's a kind of suggestion here that the native monarchy will not last and will not survive. So inevitably, someone will take it. And also that it is somehow rightfully connected to the United States, and they hark back to older generations of missionaries and then merchants who have gone out to Hawaii, and they argue have shaped its governance and its destiny.
And so, I mean, this is a very expansive book. It covers over a century. How did you go about researching it? What were the sources that you used? What were the challenges that you came across?
Yes, it is. The chronology is longer perhaps than I expected when I first started the project. When I was actually very interested to begin with in that 1890s, turn of the 20th century period, and to kind of unpack this a little bit more. But in the process of researching it in California, so I went to the Huntington Library and used a lot of a range of sources. I mean, the primary source base, I think, is quite diverse here in terms of thinking about promotional sources, travel literature, but also kind of overtly political sources in terms of legislation, speeches, debates over Hawaii and California. What I found was these connections and this relationship. It was important to go back. It was important to go back to look at the era of transcontinental expansion and kind of classic associations of manifest destiny, and think about how Hawaii became bound up with this. But equally, I didn't want to end in 1898 and just think, well, that's kind of the end of this story, because I think actually the questions about settler colonialism and about why Hawaii is not widely accepted as part of the American West play out in the 20th century, in the sense that you get new focuses by boosters, by political elites in Hawaii who see that actually the way they're going to try and attract more white Americans is going to have to be through new means. So they emphasize a process of kind of settler tourism, looking to somewhere like California, and think, well, actually the way we're going to gradually, quote, Americanize the population here is by encouraging more affluent and middle-class white Americans out to Hawaii. So that ended up taking me well into the 20th century, indeed up to Hawaiian statehood in the 1950s.
Okay, so the book is called California and Hawaii Bound. We will put a link to the book in the underneath the video. So Henry Lozano, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks very much, Richard.